Hey, glorious humans. My name's Catherine. I'm a social worker and doula turned threshold walker and a holder of sacred liminal spaces, a rewilding mentor and circles and cycles teacher. We are here in this space to talk about returning to the village, to co-create the conscious community that so many of us are yearning for. And so I am here to discuss what I believe is the foundation of what it will take for us to remember how to connect deeply with one another if we are ever to bring forth true community. I am here today to talk to you about a topic that many do not want to talk about or hear about. Something that for most people is extraordinarily uncomfortable, to the point that they avoid it at all costs, unless they absolutely can't avoid it and then often feel quite isolated. But it is something that is vital to discuss and become familiar with because it is having significant consequences on our well-being as both individuals and as a collective. As Anais Nin says, I can only connect deeply or not at all. And this is what I am here for. If we are going to connect, to return to the village, we must connect deeply. So deep we will go. The topic I wish to speak on is grief. Not just grief from the loss or death of a loved one, but also the much less discussed and less talked about grief that occurs at any and all transitions throughout our life as we grow and expand and evolve. We experience grief more frequently throughout our lives than we openly admit. And yet it is so intimately intertwined with this experience of being human. If we do not honor grief, we cannot fully embrace death in all its forms. If we do not embrace and honor death, we cannot fully embrace life itself. One of the biggest issues in our culture today is the collective death phobia and the lack of healed or even visible elders who are shunned and shamed because of their proximity to and our fear of death. Yet this is where the wisdom and vigor of life lives. It's my belief that the primary initiator or midwife of transformation is grief. As Stephen Jenkinson says, it is grief that serves as the food for life. As humans, we are constantly growing and evolving and shedding our skin to become more and more who we were here to be, our most authentic selves. But with any and all birth, always comes death, ushered in with grief. Grief stands at the threshold at each and every transformation that we ever encounter in our lifetime. For good or bad or worse, she initiates us into the next version of ourselves, no matter how forced it may feel. We cannot do anything but transform when we have been touched by grief. We cannot do anything but to connect deeply and see the immensity of this dense human experience in all of its truth when we have walked with grief. And all of its beauty as well at the same time. And all the gratitude that we feel coexists. But grief looks different for each and every person and for each and every experience. Our feelings of her also change and evolve over time. There is no one way that grief initiates transformation, and that is part of the beautiful mystery that is our own individual incarnation in this life. This is also why our rites of passage are vitally important to be acknowledged and honoured. It is through our rites of passage that we intimately meet with grief, especially if we have not met with her before, as we farewell previous versions of ourselves while rebirthing the new. As women, this most often occurs at menarche, at each birth, at menopause, and finally at death. But we also have other events that initiate us into a new phase, such as separation or divorce, death of a loved one, illness, miscarriage, early birth. And even as our children grow and change, we are letting go of one phase and ushering in another. Basically, at any time that grief shows up to assist in the embodiment of non-attachment as a core lesson in this human experience, rebirth and transformation occur. And grief often shows up unknowingly as anger, depression, and rage because we have suppressed it to the point that it starts to become explosive and unable to be processed in a more healed way. The rage and anger is our messenger, that grief is there wanting to be witnessed. Women were historically considered the weavers of life and death because of the cyclic nature of birth, growth, harvest, decay, death, and rebirth that occurs within our wombs each month, and its connection to all of the cycles of life, including the moon, the tides, the crops, and food. It was always a mystery how women could have control, seemingly have control over life in this way, and therefore there was subsequent fear that they could also bring forth death. Then the goddess cultures were destroyed, and those who revered the entire spectrum of this human experience, including death and grief, as an important and vital half of the whole, were shunned, exiled, and killed. Now we not only carry significant disconnection, but we also carry the great witch wounds, sisterhood wounds, and fear of being vulnerable with others because of the mistrust that our ancestors experienced. But the grief of not feeling safe to be vulnerable is so continuing to be prominent. So if we are to return to the village in a safe and brave and healed way, we must return to vulnerability. We must return to allowing, acknowledging, and honouring all of our vital human experiences, which often include grief, or grief and gratitude coexisting. Perhaps starting with the most pivotal moments where grief is so prominent are our rites of passage. Consider everything that occurred at your rite of passage or rites of passage, whether acknowledged or unacknowledged, and how those experiences, how you felt, how you were treated, what occurred around you as an example of what it means to be in that phase, shaped the rest of that phase and the phases thereafter. A traditional Native American saying, often quoted by Lucy H. Pierce, says, "At her first bleeding, a woman meets her power. During her bleeding years, she practices it. At menopause, she becomes it." As maidens, we first meet our power. We learn that our bodies are cyclic and that we are initiated into what it means to be a woman in our culture. We move from child to woman, often grieving our childhood selves. At the birth altar and during our bleeding years, we practice our ability to alchemize light and dark. We must learn to honour grief as a gateway into growth and power in order to mature into the wise elder during the menopause and harvest phase. Motherhood is literally the preparation phase for our harvest as elders. This and the power that comes with age is what we are so greatly disconnected from. As we age and mature into elders and get closer to death, our last sacred rite, we harvest the lessons of grief and death to pass down the wisdom about how to transmute and alchemize the darkness into light and how to live a life that honors the whole spectrum of this human experience. Our experiences with grief enter to assist us in embodying our whole nature. Everything on this cyclic planet gestates in the darkness before birthing into the light. And grief stays with us. Nothing takes it away. Our losses will always exist. But it is via grief that we truly learn what it means to hold two things in existence at the same time. Both grief and gratitude exist simultaneously. Our culture likes to fix and hide and shame vulnerability. It makes us uncomfortable to see another uncomfortable and not be able to fix it and just get on with it. And so how can we be revolutionary in our need to rewild. It is in the conscious and sacred practice of honouring grief as the balm and medicine to our constantly changing, transforming and evolving lives that bring about great loss and the coexistence of grief and gratitude that remind us of our inability to truly ever stay the same. We cannot avoid it. Grief, death, loss, they are part of life, but we can assist in its alchemization by bringing the sacred medicine of reverence and connection to ourselves, to others, and to the earth. And this is why we need to return to the village. A village that honors the whole human experience and our vital connection to the earth. We cannot understand nor embody the wholeness of our power, of our magic, of our purpose here in this time without also revering the darkest parts, the most uncomfortable parts. While we are being asked to surrender attachment, what we are in fact being initiated into is the alchemization of grief into connection. Connection being vastly different from attachment and our most primal need. Connection to self, the real self, beyond who we were told we needed to be, and connection to others in deep vulnerability, to honor our transformation, and connection to the earth. As humans, our greatest need outside of food and shelter is that of connection. While hyper-independence is highly glorified in this culture as a sign of being strong and clever, it is in fact an example of a trauma response. Humans are interdependent creatures, inherently wired for connection and co-regulation, but we are not built to grieve and transform in isolation. Hyper-independence and isolation will never see us survive in the wild. Therefore, it's not in alignment with physiological truth. Interdependence is what continues our species via the passing down of wisdom, our ability to co-regulate our nervous systems in times of stress, and in each having a sense of belonging and purpose within a community. That's how we heal. We are designed to live in multi-generational communities, not solely surrounded by people our own age, nor only in nuclear family models. These models are doing us a huge disservice and causing a whole lot of long-term issues that are contributing to further resistance around embracing grief as a necessary process. It is through grief that we are reminded of our need to be in community, to be in relationship, to be connected. And what's interesting in this vicious cycle that we seem to be living in is a collective grief for the village and community that we long for on a cellular level, yet a continued disconnection for fear of vulnerability and having to feel deeply and openly. This only creates more grief as it grows stronger to act as the messenger for us to witness her and her vital contribution to our existence. Grief becomes rougher on us because of how vastly disconnected and isolated we really are, and perhaps never realized. Grief initiates us into transformation because it brings us back home to ourselves. And it brings us back home to our truest nature, in community with others, with ourselves and with the earth. There is no longer room for ego, for superficial concern, or anything that does not serve our innate physiological truth. We are brought back on our knees to our most primal needs. Grief is a lot, especially if you've not felt it before, but it is not something that we are supposed to feel in isolation. Crying is meant to be witnessed and held. Grief needs to be treated gently, tenderly, slowly. There is no instant gratification, which we so desperately rely on today. We have been programmed to believe that if someone is feeling big feelings, then we need to do something quickly, do something to fix it. which actually says more about our own discomfort than about the person crying. But trying to do something adds to the shame that already exists for being vulnerable and often quickly stops the release. You cannot fix grief. This is part of its mysterious and beautiful medicine. Grief and all big feelings have been shamed for generations as a sign of weakness, which have therefore created all of the discomfort and avoidance that people carry today. But when we are there, we cannot unsee it. We can't unfeel it. Once we have surrendered to her and vulnerability cracks us open, we see everything differently and we are shown what is actually important in this life and what needs to go, what needs to be released, the skins we need to shed. This is why the transformation is so clear and so poignant. And this is how it serves as the food for life. In death and grief, we suddenly see life so differently. So what if we honored grief? What if we valued it even? What if we saw grief as our midwife and way shower through the process of transformation that ushers and initiates us into our greatest power and shows us what it means to be human and to be alive? What if grief really did feed our most vibrant lives if we just allowed it to? Through the honoring of grief, we will all understand the full spectrum of this human experience because we have lived death and grief, and therefore we will not only know life, we will honor it and savor it with the sacredness and reverence that it deserves, with so much more sweetness and appreciation than ever before. And we will take that into our harvest season and teach others to never fear grief or death again. And for we are born true alchemists, those that profit off our disconnection just made us forget. If we are to return to the village, we must bring with us, or at least strive to become, the healed elders, as well as the creatives, the parents and the children. We cannot have a village if we do not honour the potent service of all generations and incorporate the magic and medicine of all people. Just look at the wounded children in adults' bodies who run this world, never modelled the embodiment of healed eldership, and shunning the wise ones to feed their own egos, their own phobias, and to profit from further disconnection from our humanness. One of the most important things you can do in this life and in your work is to make friends with grief and discomfort, for that matter, to reclaim grief as the greatest tool of alchemy and the greatest way shower we have to initiate ourselves into exactly what we are here to do. It may not look how we thought it would. It may be more painful and dark than we ever expected. But at every and all times, what we need is to collectively walk each other through it, however that looks on an individual and a collective level. When we remember that we are interdependent creatures and that it is through the expression of our vulnerability that connection is formed, then we literally change the world. Brené Brown says, if we can share our story with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, shame can't survive. And when shame does not exist, absolutely everything will change. Death and grief cannot remain in the shadows. They must be met with love and witnessed as a matter of urgency. Our return to the village is a remembrance of our physiological truth, and it is a necessary revolution for humans and for our Mother Earth. It will also bring about incredible healing, intergenerational healing, as we remember the ways that we intimately wish to be, but were forced to fear for so many generations. But we cannot fully return if we are not willing to go deep into the shadows that remain. We must remember our need to sit with one another in discomfort and the medicine of connection through the honouring of grief as our greatest initiator and the food for this delicious human life. Our need for purpose and belonging is so core to our need for connection. And when we have that purpose, and that purpose is to sit with one another and witness one another, everything will change. We just need to remember that grief is this incredible initiator and food for life, and it coexists. We can have grief and gratitude, and that's what's going to bring us back together, and that's what's going to help us return to the village. Thank you so much.